So our daf for today is Nun Gimel, but we'll start with the Mishnah on daf Nun Beis Amud Beis. And the subject of this Mishnah is what's called Hezek She'eno Nikar, in which Ruvain damages Shimon. Shimon suffers a loss, but it's not a physical change in an object that was destroyed. And the Mishnah addresses three such cases of Hezek She'eno Nikar and differentiates between Shogeg and Masechet. So do we have the Mishnah on Nun Beis Amud Beis?
Yeah.
Hamitame. So he takes Truma and he's Mitame it. And Truma Tmeya can no longer be eaten. It's Asur B'Achila. Another option here in interpreting Mitame would be that he took chulin, and back in the day they were ochle chulin betara, and he was metami someone's chulin. And chulin tahorim bring in a higher rate when sold on the market than chulin tmeim. So therefore Shimon suffers a loss because now either his truma became truma tmeya, it's also bachila, or his chulin tahorim became tmeim. Then we have midamea. So on the subject of midamea, we're going to have machlokes in the Gemara, and an even more far-reaching machlokes on hamanasech. But basically, midamea means miloshen dimua, which is a taroves, and he mixes two piles of tvua that belong to Shimon. One pile is truma, and the other is chulin. So everything remains tar, but now he's going to have to sell the entire mixture to a kohen. And because of the law of supply and demand, truma is sold at a lower price than chulin. And now he has to take the entire mixture and consider it as truma, sell it to a kohen. Minasech, which literally means, and this is Rav Shita in the Gemara, that he takes yayin of his friend Shimon, and he does what's called shichshuch, which means he shakes it up for the sake of avodah zarah. And now, even though physically nothing has changed, it becomes asur b'hana. Till now we were talking about a loss in financial terms on the market, or a loss of something that was roy lachila, then it became asur b'achila. Now we're up to the final stage where it became asur b'hana midin avodah zarah. And the Mishnah makes the following statement: b'shogeg patur, b'mezid chayav. Now this is a bit strange because mimonafshach, either hezek she'eno nikar is considered hezek. And then even in Shogeg, we have a principle called Adam Muad Li'olam, which means that if a person causes a financial loss to his friend Shogeg, he didn't do it intentionally, he still has to pay for that because of the principle Adam Muad Li'olam. So if we equate Hezek She'eno Nikar with Hezek HaNikar, then he should be chayav even b'Shogeg. If, on the other hand, we're holding in this Mishnah Hezek She'eno Nikar lav shmei Hezek, then we wonder why he's chayav even in the case of Masechet. Itmar Menasech. Gemara now presents a machlokus between Rav and Shmuel how to interpret Menasech. Rav takes it literally, Menasech mamish, that he takes a barrel of wine of his friend and he shakes it up for the sake of avodas kochavim. Now, it can't be a case where he takes wine and actually pours it as a libation. And let's say there was no asra, so he's not chayav misa, because the Gemara establishes in Ksubas Daf Lamed Hey that we have a principle that b'mikra she'ein ala overchiv misa mamish ala kol shavar avayra shu mischayv ala misa im hoyu masrim bo ein mischayv ala mama. So the principle of Kim Leib and the Rabbi applies even if the action was theoretically a chiyuv misa, but in actuality it was not a chiyuv misa. For example, there was no asra. We still apply the principle of kim lev d'Rabmine. So it must be that this particular service, which the Mishnah calls menasech, is not one of those primary avodos which generate a chiyuv misa. Shmuel Amar Ma'ariv. Shmuel says that the word menasech means ma'ariv. He takes yayin nesech and he mixes it into the yayin kosher of his friend. And the Gemara is going to raise the obvious objection. What's the difference, according to Shmuel, between ma'ariv and menasech? Menasech is simply a different form of ma'ariv. So the Gemara asks the following question. Mandi omer ma'ariv, my time alo omer menasech. Shmuel is very difficult. Why didn't Shmuel accept the position of Rav and interpret the Mishnah of menasech as menasech mamish? Because Shmuel is getting us into a real, up against the wall with a real problem here, because his menasech ma'ariv is really medamea, which in the Mishnah is categorized as a separate category. Shmuel says, I can't accept Rav's interpretation of menasech mamish, because even if he's not chayav misa, befoal in actuality, he still doesn't pay damages, because this is a form of avodah zarah. Any form of avodah zarah comes under the principle of kim lev d'Rabmine, which means that we mete out the higher and more severe punishment, alleviating him of the lesser punishment. So therefore, it cannot mean in the Mishnah Menasech some sort of a deliberate act for the sake of avodah zarah, because that comes under the general rubric of avodah zarah, which generates a chiyuv misa under certain circumstances. And even in these circumstances, he be potter midin kim lev d'Rabmine. Now, why does Rav completely eliminate and ignore the principle of kim lev d'Rabmine? And here we have to introduce a principle, condition, or shall we say restriction of kim lev d'Rabmine. Kim lev d'Rabmine only applies be'idna, which means at the exact moment that you incur a chiyuv misa, you incur a chiyuv mamon. If the chiyuv mamon came one split second before the chiyuv misa, there's no kim lev d'Rabmine. Kid Rab Yirmiyah, the Rab Yirmiyah mishas hagba hu dekana. He hasn't even yet done the ma'asav avodah zarah, but he lifts up the barrel in order to shake it around. At that moment, he's already koneh b'toras gazlan, and he's going to have to pay compensation to the owner. Let's call him Shimon, to the owner of the wine. But mischai b'nashlo havi adashas nisuch. But the chiyuv misa could only be generated later on, a second later, when he does the act of avodah zarah. So there's no kim lev d'Rabmine here. Hence, the Mishnah could be talking about menasech mamish, and there would be no kim lev d'Rabmine, and he's chayav to pay for the damage that he caused to Shimon. Now, the truth is that the Torah requires that a gazlan return the object. And therefore, even after he picks up the chavis, at that point, he's really not chayav, because he could just simply put down the chavis in its place, and that would be a fulfillment of Eishuv's Agzela Shar Gazal. And this is the question that the Gemara is going to have to deal with later on in the sugya. We can't say that he's chayav midin mazik because he didn't destroy the yayin. And as far as gzela is concerned, he could simply put down the barrel, and that's hashavas hagzela. Gemara now asks the following question: Ulaman diyomin menasech. We're going to Rav, who interprets the Mishnah literally as menasech mamish. My time alo omer ma'arif. And the answer to this question is obvious. As we turn here to Daf Nun Gimel, Omer lecha, Rav would say, ma'arif hainu mitamea. Why is it necessary to have the Mishnah add another category of mitamea? Mitamea means he mixes truma and chulin, and menasech, according to the interpretation of Shmuel, is he mixes yayin nesech together with yayin kosher. In both cases, he's guilty of the same kind of a sin. I mean, different scenarios and different isurim, but it all boils down to mitamea. So menasech is also mitamea. Why would the Mishnah have to feel compelled to add menasech once we have mitamea? Vidach and how would Shmuel respond to that argument? We need both. Knasahu umi knasa lo yalfinu. Shmuel is of the opinion that our Mishnah reflects the principle of mazik hezek sheinu nikar poter. The only reason he's chayav in the three cases listed in the Mishnah is because of what's called a knas derabana. And if hezek sheinu nikar is only chayav midin knas, then we always have to analyze when and under what circumstances did Chazal institute and establish the knas. We can't compare one thing to the other. For example, maybe there was a situation that arose at a certain particular time, and the Rabbanan had to respond in order to make sure it didn't get out of control, so they made a knas. But you can never derive one knas from the other. And that's the principle that applies to knasos, that the Mishnah will always have to specify exactly which kinds of actions of dimua were included in the knas d'Rabbanan. But what about Rav? Rav was of the opinion that you could derive menasech from midamea. So the Gemara immediately asks, Ulaman diyol of knasa miknasa, according to Rav. Then the question is, Kolhani Lomali. We have three cases listed in the Mishnah, Metame, Medame, Menasech. Why did the Tana have to repeat them? If it's all under the rubric of Knas, which we call Hezek Shenu Nikar, and Rav is of the opinion that we could compare one Knas to the other, then why did the Mishnah just simply say, in a general, all-inclusive statement, that in the cases of Hezek Shenu Nikar, you have to pay because of a Knas, Utzricha. Gemara says we need each one of the three cases because each one has its own explanation and reason as to why he's chayav, and it doesn't apply to the other two. If the Tana told me that in the most severe of cases, which is called metame, he's chayav a knas and he has to pay, we could not derive any other conclusions. Like, for example, mitameh. Why? Because the ibit truma, if he took his friend Shimon's truma and he was mitameh, havamina mishum deka mafsid le legamri. Why is it that the Rabbanan instituted a knas in the case of mitameh? Because now the truma is completely inedible. It's asur b'achila. It's no longer royal achila shesiyah. Because truma tmeya is asur b'achila, asur b'shtiya. Ve'i mitama, but if you'll interpret mitama in a different way, and if you recall, Ira, we said there were two ways of interpreting mitame. It could be that he took the chulin of Shimon, and Shimon observes what we call chulin b'tara, and he was mitame Shimon's chulin. And the Gemara answers, chulin mishum di asul ligrom tuma lechulin sheberetz Yisrael. He now violates an isur because we are enjoined in Eretz Yisrael from taking chulin and being mitameit. So as a result of the Isur that he violated, Chachamim put him into a knas. Aval mitamea, in the case of mitamea, where he mixes truma and chulin, there's no Isur in doing so. It's all tahor, and it can be sold on the market to kohanim. So without violating any Isur, there's still a heter achila, albeit to kohanim. Emalo, maybe the Rabbanan did not institute a chiyuv knas to make him pay for dimua. But v'yah mishmeina mitamea, if he would have chosen the case of mitamea, mishum deshchiach, within the context of living, it's very common that chulin gets mixed up with truma. Very difficult to separate completely truma and chulin.
Right.
And we have a principle that b'milsa d'shchicha gozer b'bei rabbanim, milsa lo shchicha lo gozer b'bei rabbanim. So maybe the knas applies to this very kind of relatively common case of midabeh, which he mixes truma and chulin, but relative to midameh, mitame is very rare. It's a milsa lo shchicha. Emolo. I would have assumed that maybe the Chachamim would not make this takana and gzera of tashlume truma, paying up a truma because he was mitami truma. Who would do such a thing? To take truma being mitami it and deliberately it? So milsel shchicha gozer be'rabbanan. By contrast, in dimua is something that unfortunately gets mixed up. You know, you have chulin here, you have truma here. Now we have both mitame umitame, and the question is, why do we need menasech? Because we have mitame as a case where he deserves a knas because he took something that was mutar b'achila and he made it also b'achila, or he violated the isur of tumah of ligrom tumah be'eretz Yisrael b'chulin be'eretz. And we have the case of mitamea, where, as a result of the dimua, he did something that's shchiach. But what about menasech? Why do I need an extra chiddush in the Mishnah menasech? We're going now according to Rav, which means menasech mamish. And the Gemara answers, mishum de lo kim le'v'dramine. We need a chiddush to tell me that although in the cases of mitame and midame, there's no kimle rabine. He may have violated an isur, but it's not a chiv misa, and therefore the knas is meaningful because there's no kimle rabine. Aval menasech the kimle rabine. He's dealing with avodah zara according to Rav, and that's a chiv misa. I might think there's no room for a chiv tashlumin because of kimle rabine. Kamashma Rabbi Yirmiyah, that he already engendered a chiyuv tashlume mammon at the moment that he was magbiya. He lifted the chavis of wine off the ground. He's a gazlan, but the chiyuv misa doesn't come until later on, and that's the chiddush of our Mishnah, that he's going to have to pay for menasech because there's no kimle ramine, would not be. Now the Gemara quotes a brisa that also has these three cases of mitame, menasech, umitame. And we're going to ask, why do we need all three cases? Ulahad tani avua de Rabbi Avin. Rishono hayo omrim hamitame v'hamenasech. Only in these two cases did they establish a knas, and he has to pay. Later on, chazru lomar af hamidameh, they added a third category. So it comes out, according to the brisa, that this knas for hezek shenenika was instituted for menasech and for mitame, and only later did they add another gzera for midameh. And now we don't understand. Kol hani lamali. Why did they need a separate gzera for medamea? You've already have a gzera mitame menasech, and these are cases of hezek shedu nikar, and these are cases, as we said before, that lo shchiach. How much more so medamea should be chayev tashlumin, because the mixture between chulin and truma is something shchiach. Tzricha. Ti'i ashmina mitame shum delo kim lev. There's no hamamina that we would exempt him from paying damages in the case of mitamea under the law, the principle of kim lev ramina. We need that second chiddush of a chiv tashlumei mamon in the case of menasech, because we would have had a havamina to say he can't pay mamon because kim lev ramina. Emolo. And therefore we need the chiddush of Rabbi Yirmiyah that mishas hagba he was already chayav. Ve'im ashmeina menasech. If we thought that only menasech was chayav under the law of knas, mishum dekom mafsirei legamri, because menasech is the highest level of hefsed. It not only reduces the market value, not only does it generate an Isra Achila, but it even generates an Isra Anah. I would not be able to derive the conclusion that even in the case of Mitame, he's worthy of a knas, because Mitame means that the Truma is no longer Mutabachila, but he can use it to burn a fire with Truma Tmeya, and he puts his pot of uncooked food on top of the fire, and he cooks his pot. So there's no Isra Anah in Truma Tmeya. Lo, maybe in that case, he's not in violation of such a severe Isra, and therefore there's no Knas D'Rabbanan. And even if we knew both the case of Mitame and Menasech, we would not derive a conclusion about Midameh, because again, what's Midameh? Midameh means he mixes Truma and Chulin. All right, so let him sell it to Kohanim at a slashed price. Mishum dehefsid meruba. In the case of Mitameh, or in the case of Menasech generating an Isra Anah, and Mitame generating an Isra Achila, there's a pretty severe financial loss. But what kind of financial loss does he suffer in a mixture between Truma and Chulin? Emolo. Maybe in this case, the Chachamim did not go that far to institute a Knas. Tzricha, and therefore I need all three cases. Just going to take a second to get a drink. Sorry. Now, the Mishnah establishes that the Chacham made a takana in three cases, Mitam, Midam, and Asech, that he pays only in the case of Mezid, but he's potter in the case of Shogeg. And this Mishnah that we learned here on Daf Nun Beis Amud Beis belongs to an entire series of Mishnayos that really make up this entire parak, the fifth parak of Gittin, called Tikkun Olam. Omar Chizkiah, Dvar Torah, on a Doraisa level, Echad Shogeg Echad Mezid Chayav. In other words, Adam Muad Liolam. And if you mazik someone, you have to pay damages and compensate him for his loss, even if you did it only b'shogeg. Why my time of hezek shein and ikar shmei hezek? Chizkiah maintains that there's no difference between a physical, obvious destruction of an object or change in the object and something which is only legal, halachic, abstract. It's enonika. And in both cases, the Torah says, you caused them a damage. There was a maisa hezek for which you have to pay. So now we have to ask the other question. So why in the case of Shogeg is he potter? And that's going to be a tikkun olam. Well, my timer omru. It's funny, Ira, how the word tikkun olam today took on a different meaning. I don't know if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
The
definitely.
reform Judaism has something called tikkun olam. But this is the original, This, let's say Reuven was Mitami Menasech, the Peros of Shimon. We have to induce Reuven to tell and notify Shimon that his Peros are awesome, because otherwise Shimon might be Nechshal in Achila Surah. If we're going to make him pay, then he's not going to be motivated to come forward and notify the Bailim, in this case Shimon, that he was Mitami Menasech because he'll have to pay damages, and he only did it b'shogeg. So in order to give him room and motivation to come forward and notify the Bailim about what happened, we're going to say, you know what, you don't have to pay, you did it b'shogeg. If you're making a tikkun olam to encourage and motivate the mazik to admit that he was mazik, otherwise the nizak might come to be nichshal in an isa, then even in the case of mezid, we should have made that tikkun olam. And the Gemara says, hashta lo zuki kamacham, duye lo modile. We're dealing with a scoundrel. We're dealing with a person who intentionally was mazik his friend's peros with a malicious intent, absolutely deliberate. So it's quite possible that he's not going to be modia his friend, even if you exempt him from paying damages. We're not dealing with someone who's within the fold, and we could say, all right, we'll let you off the hook, and hefker bezin hefker, you don't have to pay damages because you're a shogeg, and that'll motivate you to come forward and tell the Bailim that he's got to be noiganis. But in the case of a mezid, he's already out of the fold. He's never going to be motivated to notify the nizak, to notify Shimon the Balaperos that he's got a problem with an Israchi. So that's Chizkiah. So let's just summarize. Chizkiah holds Hezek Shenu Nikar Shmei Hezek. And even in the case of Shogeg, according to the law of the Torah, he'd be chayav to pay damages. Odamud Liolam. However, the Rabbanim made a tikkun olam, and they alleviated the mazik of paying damages in the case of a shogeg, even though midaraisa is chayav. And the reason they did so is to motivate him to come forward and notify the Bailim. Rabbi Yochanan Amar the exact opposite. Dvar Torah echad shogeg vechad beisid potu. On a doraisa level, my time hezek shenikor lo shmei hezek. And this is not included under the halacha of mazik. Mazik means that you destroyed someone's physical object. Here, you don't destroy the object at all. And if that be the case, then we have to ask the opposite question that we raised according to Chizkiah. My time Omer b'mezid chayim. Why did the Rabbanim make a takana and a knas that b'mezid he has to pay damages? The Torah says he's alleviated from damages, but the answer is almost obvious. This guy's amazing. He wants to destroy and inflict damages on his friend. He's malicious. And if he knows that he's patur, there are no repercussions, then
right.
Blanche is what he's going to go ahead and do. Now, here in the note, he quotes the Chassam Sofer. By the way, Ira, you could wish me a happy birthday today.
Oh,
yeah.
Yom Huladas. Happy birthday.
July 2nd, yeah.
Oh, very nice.
I don't know, at this point in my life, I don't know how nice it is. It's a little scary, you know what I mean? But thank God I still have energy,
Thank God.
So he quotes here Chassam Sofer. And he says the following. This is an amazing chiddush. He says that according to Rabbi Yochanan, Hezek Sheinu Nikar Lav Shmei Hezek, and it's clear that in the case of Mazik Chavero Behezek Sheinu Nikar, he's Potem Midaraisa. But yet, He's not allowed to do so. He violates an Isur Dorais. He doesn't have to pay damages. So in Dini Momenos' terms, it's Eino Shmei Hezek, but it still is considered a mazik to violate two Isurim. Number one, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, and number two, Lo tisnas achicha bilvavecha, because we're talking about a mazid here. In fact, the Torah prohibits even onas dvarim under these Isurim and these lavim. How much more so if he damages his friend's property and causes his friend a loss. So there's no svar whatsoever to say that Minat Torah he's allowed to be mafsid chavero behezek she'eino nikar. However, as far as Didi Momenos is concerned, if not for a knas that was imposed upon him by Bezdin, he would not have to pay damages, even though he violates these Isurim. And the Rabbanan felt in the case of Mesa, they had to institute this knas to be mechayev to pay damages. Otherwise, carte blanche, this deliberate, malicious mazik is going to feel he could do it and get away with it. There are no repercussions. Now the Gemara quotes a Mishnah later on from Daf Nun Daled Amud Beis as a kash on Chizkiah. And let's keep reviewing this. Chizkiah holds Hezek She'eino Nikar Shmei Hezek. Tanan. HaKohanim shepiglu b'mikdash. I never understood why a Kohen could be malicious about this, but I guess there's certain hatred and whatever it is. Anyway, so the Kohen had a machshava at the time of one of the avodos, whether it's b'shas shchita, b'shas rika, or b'shas holacho of Kabbalah Saddam, and so forth and so on, that the karba would be eaten chutz l'zmano, beyond the allotted time for achila, and now the karba becomes pigul. This is a classic case of hezek she'eino nikar. And the Mishnah is going to establish that mezidim, if the Kohen was a mezid, again, very hard to believe that a Kohen would be suspect of such a thing, but he did it b'mezid, and he causes the Bailam a tremendous loss because Pigul is also by no, he's going to have to replace the carbon with another carbon. And Vitoni Allah, the Brisa says regarding this Mishnah that the Rabbanan made a takana mipnei tikun olam. Now wait a second. According to Chizkiah, forget about tikun olam. On a doraisa level, he would have to pay damages, this Kohen, because hezek she'eino nikar shmei hezek, and if he was a mezid, then you don't have to introduce a tikun olam, a knas d'Rabbanan, to justify the chiyuv that he has to pay. This is based on hezek she'eino nikar shmei hezek. So therefore, v'yamer hezek she'eino nikar shmei hezek, according to you, Chizkiah, what it should say in that Mishnah is not that he pays damages in a case of a Kohen who was mefagel b'mezid, but rather the contrary. The Mishnah should have emphasized the chidush that in the case of shogeg, he's potter. As we said before, to encourage him to notify the bailim that it's pigul and it's also about no, it's a chi of kares if you eat it. And the Gemara answers hachinami kamer. That's what we're going to have to fit into this brisa. Mezidin chayavim hashogim peturim mipnei tikunol. We have to add the words mipnei tikunol. Masiv Rabbi Lazar is now going to raise a kasha against Chizkiah of hezek she'eino nikar shmei hezek from a brisa. Now we're talking here in this brisa about two categories. They're really two sides of the same coin. One is called mechatos, and the other called paras chatos. So a para aduma has to be shechted, and then we burn its meat, and we make from the burnt para efer chatos. So that's paras chatos. What's efer chatos? Efer chatos means that we take the burnt para aduma and we mix it with a concoction of other elements, and we make me chatos, which we sprinkle through a hazah onto a tavi mes. And now the Brisa says he did malacha, which passels either mechatos or paras chatos. In the case of paras chatos, the Torah says, "Asher lo Allah leha ol," and therefore, by doing malacha with the para, he disqualifies the para aduma. That's a tremendous loss, as you can imagine. A para aduma would be worth, as the Israelis would say, hon to'afot. Now, as far as mechatos is concerned, so there's a sifri that darshans the pasuk l'mishmeres l'mei nida. What does mishmeres mean? That the mei nida or the mechatos has to be shmira. There has to be shmira to make sure and guarantee that no malacha was done with the mechatos. And if malacha was done with mechatos, then it becomes disqualified. So what's the status of this person as far as Dine Mazik is concerned? Does he have to pay? The Brisa says explicitly that on a Doraisa level, B'din Adam, here in our courts, he's not chayiv to pay. He's chayiv midin shamayim on a moral, ethical level because his kavanah was to be mafsid his friend, and he did so b'mezid. But why is he potter b'dini adam according to Chizkiah? Iyamrit hezek sheinu nikar shmei hezek b'dini adam nami l'chayev. He should be chayev b'dini adam. Who mosiv love, who mefarik love. This is, by the way, a phrase that I use all the time. Even Charney knows what it means. Who mosiv love, mefarik. So Rabbi Lazar answers this brisa, even though he was the one who raised the objection, and now he defends Chizkiah. And he says there's no kasha here from Hezek, Shenanika Shmei Hezek, because when the brisa says that he's patur, it's talking about a case where lo asa malacha biyadayim. So what we're holding now in the case of Groma, an indirect hezek. What's the case? Para. How did he passel the para? Shechnisa l'Rivka. He takes the para and brings it into the place where the cows are, the mother cows are feeding the baby cows. Almanashetino v'tadush. So the mazik here indirectly caused the situation where the paraduma would nurse the calf, or he brings the paraduma to a place where the feet of the para are actually crushing the tvua. And that's where the Ravka was, where they brought the animals, where they would crush the grains. Now, in these cases, we have to add another condition, and that is kavanah. It's not enough that the animal actually did the disha. He has to bring the cow into the Ravka. He, by the way, spells it Ravaka. Okay, I never heard it like that, but anyway. And he did so for this express purpose of Disha. But then again, it's only Grama. Now, we have a principle called Grama b'nezikim poter. Indirect damage, you don't have to pay for, at least midin Adam. So in this case of the brisa of Oseh Malacha V'Mechatos, so first we have Oseh B'Malacha B'Paraduma, and that's the case where he brought it to the Revaka, Amanas Shetidosh, etc. And now, what's the case of Oseh Malacha V'Mechatos? Sheshakal Behem Mishkolos. So what he has is a scale, and the Mechatos he places on one side of the scale, And on the other side of the scale, he has a mishkal, and he knows exactly what it weighs. Let's say it weighs 5 pounds. So he's going to weigh out the mayim. Or, for example, let's say he knows the weight of the mayim, and he puts the mayim on one side of the scale, and on the other kaf, on the other side of the scale, he puts whatever he puts, and he wants to know its weight, and he can determine it by using the mechatos on the other side of the scale. In all these cases, he's patur, even though he disqualifies the mechatos because it's only groma b'nezikin. So Rava immediately objects. Amar Rava, mechatos sheshakal b'mishkoles sheira. You're assuming that if you use the mechatos as a mishkal, then that's called malacha b'mechatos, and it passes and invalidates the mechatos to be used for hazoya. But that's not true, because shakal b'hen mishkolos, that's not considered a malacha that would passel the mechatos. So that's not considered asiyas malach. Now you're telling me that he's chayav if he does this b'mezid because he was mazik mechatos, means you're assuming that the mechatos is possible. And yet we know that shakal b'mishkolos is kshera, lo kasha. Ha begufan, v'ha bekenegdo. When the Brisa speaks about mishkolos, it's begufan shel mayim. So there's mayim in a receptacle, and it's like our measuring cups. It has different lines, and basically you look and see what level the water reached, and you'll know exactly what it weighs. And then he takes something and he puts it into the water, and the water level goes up. He knows to differentiate, to subtract the increment from the original weight of the water. So then he's using the mayim itself, because the mayim itself is going to rise. But when Rava says that shakal b'shkolos lo nifsalu, that's a case of the kaf b'oznayim that we described before, where he puts the water on one side of the scale, weighing a piece of meat on the other side of the scale, basically because he knows the weight of the water. But he's not really doing an action directly in the mechatos, like the first case where he measures the mechatos and then puts something inside the mechatos. So now the Gemara swings back to its original kasha. Begufan, if the Brisa is talking about a case of mishkolos begufan, Masechet ka'ovid behu, he's doing a Masechet hezek in a direct way by putting the meat inside the water. The hezek she'enika shmei hezek b'dinei adam nami l'chayev. He should be chayev in dinei adam. The Brisa says that, let's go back to the language of the Brisa, that also malacha mechatos potem midinei adam. Why is he potem midinei adam? We hold like Chizkiah that hezek she'enika shmei hezek, and then he did a ma'aser begufa shel mayim. Otherwise, he didn't pass the mayim, so he wouldn't be chayav even b'din shemayim. Ela idi ve'idi bekenegdon. So now if it's kenegdon, where he's using it on two sides of a scale, and it's not begufan, and we establish based on Rava's principle that there's no psul in the mayim, the Brisa, which clearly presumes that the mayim became pasul, that's a case of asachat daite. The Torah requires shmira, as we said before. What was the pasuk again? Mishmeres meinida. And the opposite of shmira is hesech hadas. And may chatos become pasul b'hesech hadas because the Torah requires mishmeres. The mishmeres l'meinida. B'dinei adam is not chayav because there's no ma'aser b'yadayim. Right? We're talking about a case now of what do you call it? Of kenegdon. And if it's Kenegdon, two sides of a scale, it's not a Ma'aseh B'Yadayim, it's only Grama. So therefore he can't be Chayev on a level of Didi Adam as a Mazik. But the Rav is talking about a case. The Mayim does not become possible because there was no Hesek Hadas. Even when he's weighing the meat by putting the meat on the other side of the scale, he still has focus on the Mechatos. He has not disconnected his awareness of the Mechatos. And this leads us up to Rav Papa's Kasha, which is based on the Mishnah in Bava Kama. And that Mishnah would seem to support the position that Hezek Sheinu Nikar Lav Shmei Hezek, which is the position of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, if we conclude beyond a shadow of a doubt, based on the Mishnah that we're about to learn in Bava Kama Tzadi Vav, that Hezek Sheinu Nikar Lav Shmei Hezek, then the only way of defending Chizkiah, that Hezek Sheinu Nikar Shmei Hezek, is through the principle called Ketanoi, that we're going to find two Tanoim, and Chizkiah was standing on the shoulders of one Tan. Moser Rav Papa, Gazal Matbea V'Nifsal, a person steals a coin of his friend. Now, the coins had value, minted coins, only as long as the government backed up the coins. But if the government decides that we want to change the coins, we no longer use the coins with Queen Elizabeth, now we want to use the coins with a different queen, right? So the coin becomes valueless. No one's going to take it. It's lost its status as valid currency. Another case, Gozel Truma. He stole Truma Tahora. And then Nitmes. A sheretz fell on top of the Truma. Chametz, he stole Chametz for Orlova Pesach. So in all these cases, there's a loss by virtue of the fact that the time passed and the situation changed. Omer Lo, the Gazan has a right to say to the Bailam, I'm giving you back exactly what I stole from you. This is the coin I stole from you. This is the chametz I stole from you. This is the truma I stole from you. V'yamrid hezek she'nirika shmei hezek. Hi Gazlan. Mamona me'alya boy l'shlume. Tiyuvta. So we have a clear-cut indication by this in this Mishnah that hezek she'nirika lav shmei hezek. Otherwise, he's a Gazlan, and he's not returning the object that has the value of the object that he stole, and therefore he has to pay like any Gazlan under the law of Heshav's like Zelisha Gaza. And yet the Mishnah says that he can pat himself up by saying Hareshal Chofanecha, just take it back. It must mean that Hezek She'er Nikar Lav Shmei Hezek. And the only way we can defend Chizkiah, says the Gemara, is Lema Ketanoi. And that means that we're going to quote another Tana, in this case in a Brisa, that maintains Chizkiah's position that Hezek She'er Nikar Shmei Hezek. And that's going to be the position of Rabbi Meir in the Brisa that records Machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda about Mitame, Medame, Umenasech. Rabbi Meir is of the opinion Echad Shogeg V'Echad Mezid Chayim, which means Hezek She'er Nikar Shmei Hezek. Rabbi Yehuda says B'Shogeg Potu Mezid Chayav. There was a separate takana to be Mechayav and B'Mezid, so as to discourage people from doing such a malicious act. My Labalka Miflagi, the Mar So Rabbi Meir is of the opinion Hezek She'er Nikar Shmei Hezek. Umar So Rabbi Yehuda is of the position Hezek She'er Nikar Lo Shmei Hezek. So therefore, Chizkiah could stand on the shoulders of Rabbi Meir that Hezek She'er Nikar Shmei Hezek. Therefore, he's chayav both in Mezid and in Shogeg. And Shogeg is patur only according to Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda holds Hezek She'er Nikar Lav Shmei Hezek. And the Rabbanan made a takana to try to discourage a Mezid, but they never made such takana in the case of Shogeg. They wanted to encourage him to be Modia the Bailam. And Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak rejects it. Kuli Alma, even Rav Meir holds that what Hezek Shenenika Lav Shmei Hezek. And what is therefore the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda regarding Shogeg? This we know from Parakira in Shabbos, that very often the Chazal will institute a knas in Shogeg in order to avoid a situation of Mezid. The Marisol Rav Meir holds Konsu Shogeg or to Mezid. The Chachoma Mechayev him even in the case of Shogeg, because otherwise he would be tempted to do it even for Mezid. And again, even though Mezid here, we're holding Hezek Shenenika Lav Hezek is only a Knas to Rabbanon, but within the context of that Knas, the Rabbanon established a Knas that would include even the case of a Shogeg. Umar so Rabbi Yehuda holds Lo Konsu Shogeg Otu Mezid. Okay, so then the Gemara is going to go through the sugya in Kira about Mevashel B'Shabbos, and the Gemara is going to size up and compare the various shitas. I'm just going to make a note of where we got up to. Okay then. So I really wish you a good week.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, we have a fast day coming up soon. Yeah,
I got that.
Yeah,
I know.
All right, but a birthday is still a happy day, I guess.
Yeah, happy birthday. It's so nice.
Yeah, thanks. All right, call too. Have a great week.